Meantime, Russia continues to bombard some key cities.
And for more on that, let's check in with our correspondent, Sarah Williamson, who is live on the ground in Kyiv. Sarah?
Well, Bob and Heather, despite some areas in the south suffering heavy blows, up in the north of the country, Ukraine is gaining a lot of ground. Bucha City Council is saying that Ukraine's military has surrounded the towns of Bucha, Irpin and Hostomel in the Kyiv Oblast. And apparently, according to the mayor of Irpin, 80% of the suburb has been taken back by Ukraine. So this is certainly good news. There has been mass evacuations of Irpin and the surrounding areas in recent weeks, but around 6,000 civilians still remain, with 4,000 not wanting to leave their homes, despite the constant shelling of Grad systems. Now, the National Police are saying today that they're resuming their work in Irpin. So again, this means that the Russian troops northwest of Kyiv are now encircled, and Ukraine can continue to push back against the Russian advance towards Kyiv. Also, Ukrainian forces claimed yesterday that they have taken back the city of Makariv, also in that northwestern area. So it's looking promising for the Ukrainians up that end of the country as we head into the 1 month mark of this war. Bob and Heather.
All right, Sarah, thank you.
Meanwhile, some are saying that NATO allies are showing signs of cracks, with some disagreements of how to arm Ukrainians.
This all comes while dealing with the growing threat of China. So how will NATO drive a wedge in the relationship between Putin and Xi Jinping of China? Our correspondent Alex Salvi has the latest. Alex.
Bob, Heather, President Biden is wheels up on his way right now to Brussels ahead of high-stakes meetings taking place on Thursday. He'll be meeting with NATO leaders as well as G7 leaders and the European Commission. So we should see a military, an economic, and a political response to what's currently happening right now in Ukraine. When it comes to NATO, that's where we'll see some of the military developments. We know earlier today that NATO members announced that they would be bolstering their military in the eastern flank, most notably in the countries of Hungary, Bulgaria, Slovakia, Romania as well. They are also announcing that they're sending additional equipment to Ukraine to help them deter different threats on the cyber front, the radiological front, even the nuclear front. So we already are seeing what's called deliverables, tangible action on behalf of NATO allies when it comes to responding to the current situation. We know that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky will play a role in tomorrow's meeting with NATO, once again probably requesting the same things he has in the past, such as missile defense systems, probably reiterating his call for a no-fly zone. But as you said, when it comes to the G7 and the European Commission, that's where sanctions will be the primary topic. We know that President Biden, as Amanda said earlier in the show, that he will be applying additional sanctions against the Russian legislature. But there's also questions about those who enable Russia during this time. Most notably, China will be watching a very close eye on this entire situation, because at this point, China has been on the fence somewhat. They've condemned the Russian invasion while at the same time continuing to participate with them economically, financially. There is going to be additional pressure over the coming days to make them pick a side, whether they want to be with Western leaders or if they want to be with Russian President Vladimir Putin. That is going to be a conversation that comes up later in the day at the G7 and the European Commission meetings. Bob? Heather?
All right, Alex, thank you very much. And of course, there in Brussels, the president's supposed to arrive, I believe, 4 o'clock our time, East Coast time. That could give or take. We don't know, but somewhere around there. That's when the president is expected to arrive in Brussels, where Alex is. As reports say that the stakes are high, but the expectations may be low. So what could come of this? Joining us now to discuss, former Navy SEAL and Florida congressional candidate Brady Duke. Brady, you have a big military background, and I don't know if you know offhand, maybe this is a diplomatic question, but we were trying to figure out, what does it mean when the Secretary of State identifies Russia as an army committing war crimes? Does that justify then NATO's next step in saying we need a modern-day Berlin airlift to provide supplies for the people of Ukraine, or is there something military that this would imply?
Well, Bob and Heather, thank you so much for having me on. To answer your question, looking at the facts of what's going on in Ukraine, there are definitely war crimes being committed under the command of Putin, no doubt about that. And there's a lot of people suffering because of this. I mean, I think we have over 3 million people that have been evacuated from Ukraine at this point. And so, there's a number of organizations that are even here out of the state of Florida that are working hard to help those refugees leave the country and get the needed care that they require, having left a war zone. So, I think we have to ensure that we're doing what we can to look out for the innocent people in this. And there's no doubt about that there's war crimes happening with the bombing of hospitals and school buildings and daycare centers and things like that, where there seems to be no care for, fighting in this war in a way that really has any dignity for human life.
Yeah, it's interesting that this declaration is made while Secretary Blinken is on the plane heading to Brussels with President Biden, and the determination that it's the Russian military troops that have committed these war crimes, and it doesn't specify President Putin as committing these war crimes, even though he's the one that is obviously calling the shots. Brady, what more do you think the Biden administration needs to do, particularly heading into this meeting with NATO?
Well, I think, from a war fighting perspective, it takes a lot to sustain, a war fighting element. With my background in the SEAL teams in close quarters combat and urban warfare, people need to be sustained with small arms, with ammunitions, with shoulder fired rockets. These are the types of things that, with a good fighting heart and spirit and enough training, you can be wildly successful and accurate in deterring attacks upon yourself and your community. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing. And so, President Zelensky definitely needs support in these ways so that he can ensure that he's protecting his people. And, it's something that if we want to see a difference made, we have to start electing people of virtue into Congress. That's why I'm running for Congress, is so that we can hold people like Biden and his administration accountable for the position that he has put our country in at this point, because we are in a very vulnerable and weak position. And the calls he made on day one and his retreat in Afghanistan have all signaled to Putin that there is going to be no consequence to what he decides to do.
So, Brady, what should be done? You're welcome to take a sentence or two to say what should have been done before, but given where we are right now, what would you like to see done?
I think we need to send a message to Putin that he absolutely needs to stop and think about what he's doing, and that there will be massive consequences to his economy. We need to shut down his economy. I think we also need to take a look at what's going on within his country and the propaganda arm that he runs within his own country to ensure he can continue to do what he's doing by leaving his people misinformed. So there's a number of different things that I think have to take place.
Would that be cyber? Are you talking about cyber attacks that try to affect that?
I mean, I think that's absolutely something that needs to be affected. Is we need to ensure that, number one, that America is being looked after. And number two, that we can affect what leverage he has over the minds of his people being deceived by him as their leader, and to be able to continue this. I mean, we've seen this with even the Russian soldiers pressing into the eastern side of Ukraine, not even fully knowing what it was that they were doing and being told that they were on training missions. And so there is so much propaganda involved in this war that we have to take an active role in stopping in defeating that.
And that's what I wonder, some of what may be behind the wording in this declaration of the war crimes that we were just reading, as breaking news moments ago. Perhaps the reason it is worded that way, that it's the Russian troops and the military, maybe this would be another effort to get perhaps some of Putin's own people to turn against him, the Russian military troops themselves, to refuse to fight and not do, the things that they're being asked to do, that, as you said, Brady, they were not even aware of until they got there to Ukraine, what the real situation was. Brady, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.